also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As today we're probably going to be talking a lot about protest, repression, and our experiences over the past 2 years, we say that acknowledging that the law on protest and the tools used by police to repress protests started with and continues to first and foremost target First Nations activists since colonisation as they continue to resist the ongoing colonisation in this country. I'd also just like to acknowledge my fellow Palestine Action Group members who are with us here today, Josh and Yasmin, who have done great work over the past 2 years, and of course our legal representatives, Amanda, who's somewhere in the room, Mahmoud, Felicity Graham, who couldn't be with us today. And also Brian solicitors, who have probably racked up hundreds of $1,000s in legal bills that we've never paid them, probably never will. Protest, of course, has been under unprecedented attack. At least that has been the line drawn by many civil society organisations and politicians who are in rightfully abysmal shock as to how the Minns government, but also mainstream media, have criminalised and demonised protests, particularly over the last 2 years of anti-genocide and anti-war protests. 150 Special Operations Police raided activists to militantly engage in direct action that sought to save the environment. At the time, the Sydney Morning Herald described these activists as authoritarian. This did not happen in the past 5 years, and it was not an attack on our students, on Blockade Australia, or Rising Tide. It was actually an attack on the Building Labour's Federation in the 70s, an attack which spanned over a decade, an attack which was launched by the Labor government in the wake of union militancy, which reshaped the way we looked at protests, and at the time truly showed us what democracy looked like. The reason why I bring this up, something that happened so long ago, was to shape a picture and remind us all that the present attack on protest is not unprecedented. Protest has always been under attack. However, right now, as crises escalate, as situations become catastrophic across the world, genocide, floods, wildfires, mass detention of immigrants, all the paradoxes of liberal democracy have collided at one another and quite literally erupted into flames. Militancy is increasingly being viewed by people as a democratic obligation, not an inconvenience, and simultaneously protest is threatening this very system that we live in, and the state has put us under attack. Now let me paint a picture of a liberal democratic state. For the past 2 decades, which is literally the time I have been alive, the liberal democratic state has convinced us, particularly young people, that we can achieve change through our participation, through voting, through electing diverse representatives, and through lobbying. We were told to become lawyers, policymakers, and join NGOs. This is how we will make change, we were told. However, over the past few years, the younger generation is witnessing all the paradoxes of our systems erupt in lifetime, and we simply stopped believing this. Because I am stubborn, I did see my goals through and I did become a lawyer, but I did make sure to never stop being an activist. This generation has witnessed 2 years of genocide. We have seen shipments of weapons travel to Israel from around the globe to exterminate an entire population. We have seen our governments fail to mobilise against these atrocities. Rather, governments around the world greenlit this genocide and collectively lit Gaza on fire. It was this urgent, catastrophic situation, the first live-stream genocide, which opened the minds, hearts, and eyes of young people around the world to our rotten system. For 2 years, we witnessed men, women, and children being burnt to ash, while our leaders beat the drums of war. We've seen taxpayer dollars fund the bombs which are killing the children in Gaza, while here at home, our hospitals are crumbling, people sleep on the streets, and climate disasters grow deadlier by the day. And we've seen who profits from it all: the billionaires, the arms dealers, and imperial powers. This is exactly just like Vietnam and just like Iraq. And exactly like then, the people rose up. What this tells us is the state has never respected the right to protest, and it has always been secondary to the state's imperialist interests and goals. At times, it has been fully violated in some of the most heinous and atrocious ways, notably the soul of my comrade, Hannah Thomas, who joins us here tonight, which will have permanent lifelong implications on her. At other times, it appears to have been honoured by the state, but it was always conditional on something. Should a protest like Palestine, one which exposes empire, which puts the system under threat, at most by targeting the very arteries of the profit-fueling war machine, like Palestine Action in the United Kingdom, who have targeted Elbit systems and ensured they do not continue to profit from the genocide in Gaza, they have shamefully been declared a terrorist organisation. But also the very marches that fill the hubs of city around the world, where ordinary people declare we do not consent to genocide. When liberal democratic states have long relied on consent to fuel the engines of this rotten system, mass ideological pushback is just as large as a threat to this system as the targeting of the very weapons being used in this genocide. And this is exactly why protest matters and why it is currently under attack. The Palestine Action Group has faced 2 years of criminalisation, whether or not we have been in the courtroom. At the start of this genocide, we were labelled as violent extremists, terrorist supporters, anti-Semites. And the Minns Labor government declared that we will never be allowed to march the streets of Sydney. The media latched onto this campaign, and they all collectively used the language of criminality to dissuade the population from joining the masses, because they tried to convince everyone that opposing a genocide was criminal or immoral. We did not need police batons and arrest cars to criminalise Palestinian protests. It was the very pens being used to write the articles in our papers doing that itself, and they were just as dangerous as any police baton or any gun. But we persevered because it was the right thing to do. We continued to mobilise despite the attacks, despite attempts to crush protest, despite repression, and despite lots of legislation being introduced by the Minns government in an attempt to corner us. Over the past 2 years, even when dragged into courtrooms, we never gave the state an inch. We never sold our demands to the state who fuels this genocide and its proxies for the right to march on our, not their streets. Because the only way to fight back on the attack to protest is by mobilising the global protest movement across the world and ensure a continual mass, not a singular individual, but mass opposition to the state's attempt to manufacture consent for this genocide. And I believe it is because, and not in spite of, this mass movement, that when images of starved children were on our screens, the screams of the people on the streets for the past 2 years could not be muffled, and there was no way to propagate this. There was no opportunity to justify this and push back. At this point, Israel had already been ideologically exposed, and this was the floodgate bursting open. There was no holding it back anymore. But the drums of war at this point had not stopped. They had only gone silent. The Australian government was still arming Israel. We were still fueling this genocide, and we as a movement needed to fill this vacuum, not with silence, but with action and a mass demonstration that could not be ignored. And that's why we urgently called a march on the Harbour Bridge to demonstrate that we do not consent to this, and we need it to end now. And indeed, this was a terrifying moment for the state. The Harbour Bridge is an iconic symbol, and filling it with people will make our message impossible to ignore. It will expose the state for refusing to bow to the will of the people and for continuing to fuel a genocide we refuse to be complicit in. This moment is reminiscent of the Vietnam and Iraq war protests. While our presence on the streets, like theirs, didn't end these wars overnight, those protests became turning points in history, moments we look back on and recognise as clear evidence that our governments, unfortunately, do not act in our interests. This is one of those moments, a system-exposing moment, and it shows that our democracy hasn't strengthened, improved, or become more just, despite what we are constantly told to believe. Further to this, the Harbour Bridge is no different, in my view, to a port or a factory in an industrial period. It is the main artery of the economy and keeps profits circulating. This was unprecedented disruption that the state simply could not bear. For these reasons, our protest was prohibited. I could go into another 30-minute talk into the language used around Forms 1's authorisation and unauthorised protest, but I do not have that time. But I do guarantee I did give a mini law lecture to a lot of journalists that week, and those lectures fell on deaf ears and they kept on using very incorrect language. But what I want you all to imagine when I discuss this court case is a pendulum, an unbalanced pendulum, one that is rigged on the side of the state that swings in favour of property and the economy and the state's interests. On the other side is the right to protest. Disruptive protests rarely win because the system is simply rigged against us. But in this case, we did in fact win, obviously to the thanks of our many lawyers in the room. But we won, but we cannot ignore that we won because of the masses. It was because the declaration all over New South Wales, but all over the country, that the people will march this bridge with or without the state's consent. The very weight of this declaration shifted the pendulum in our favour, and in doing so, we undid years of anti-protest laws, years of the attempts by the state to crush dissent in this country. We blocked a bridge when laws exist to imprison people for 2 years for doing so. And in doing so, we demonstrated and reminded society that the right to protest is not one in Parliament, it is not one in the courts, but it is one on the street through the masses. And the decision by Justice Rigg is a testament of the importance of mass movements to win our civil liberties. It is the system or movements that we mobilise against that try to crush us. And I mean, look at this weekend. We have Nazis mobilising across the country on March 31st for a racist and deplorable March for Australia. They are mobilising the street in a system that upholds white supremacy, and no one has even dared to prohibit or even use the language of criminalisation against them. Language that was used against us for 2 years when we were fighting against the genocide, the most heinous of racist crimes. So if we are fighting back against a system which will criminalise us, we cannot win our rights through this very system. We can certainly exploit its tools, but it is us and only us, the masses, the people, who can fight back. The right to protest is not under an unprecedented attack. And history tells us that this is not the end of the struggle. History tells us, and recent events reminds us, that the right will be won by fighting back, by showing our so-called democratic leaders what democracy actually is. And this is a struggle, so it takes time and perseverance. It took us at the Palestine Action Group, but also Palestine movements around the world to reach the moment where we can march Australia's most iconic symbol and bridge, when 2 years ago we were told that we would never even be allowed on the streets. And it is our obligation to continue building against this system. Genocide is unfolding before our eyes. Our streets are still filling up with people who do not have homes. Our environment is collapsing. Racist laws are being enforced on a daily basis against First Nations people across this country. And none of this is separate. It is all connected. It is all the same system. And we must stand up, build power, and fight back together relentlessly and without fear. We are in a new chapter in history, and the time to fight is now. Thank you.